Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dean Detloff.
And I'm your other co-host, Matt Bernico.
Matt, we're back in the basement with a big bulletin board with Bible verses, pictures of dragons, all kinds of beasts with many eyes, all on the board, verses, pictures of Donald Trump, Apache helicopters, vaccines. We've got lines and strings going from all these things as we try to continue to make sense of the book of Revelation in our apocalyptic times. Matt, what's going on for you right now in these days of our current apocalypse?
Well, I don't know. The world is always ending, is what we said a few weeks ago, and I am quitting one job to start a new job. So that's pretty cool. That's kind of an apocalyptic moment if you think about it, a sort of big sudden shift.
True.
Not as apocalyptic as some moments, you might say, but it feels apocalyptic to me. It's been stressful, but it's not like, probably the same thing as Nicolas Maduro getting kidnapped or whatever by the United States government, sort of different magnitudes of apocalypticism, but I'll stand by it.
That sounds pretty good. It is definitely the end of one thing, the beginning of another thing, and that is the apocalypse. Over here, I'm kind of in the same boat. I'm not starting a new job, but I've been staying home for a while, which is unusual for me. I travel a lot for work, and I'm getting ready to travel again, so I feel like my period of sedentary life when I've built a set of routines that I appreciate is about to be utterly disrupted as I go to several different time zones in the coming weeks and don't understand what time it is or when I should sleep. So that's my personal apocalypse that I'm getting ready for.
Nice. There's always sort of an apocalypse around the corner, and no apocalypse is more apocalyptic than the book of Revelation. That's right, folks. Some people have been watching the Super Bowl this past week, which is not apocalyptic, really. But if you think about it, the book of Revelation is the Bible's Super Bowl. That's when all the big stuff happens.
Whoa.
And I know that's surprising to you, maybe, but it's true. And this week we're going to be talking about Revelation again, but we're going to be talking about it through the lens of a book called Apocalypse, a people's commentary on the book of Revelation by Pablo Ricard, a liberation theologian. So it should be pretty cool. We decided to take this one kind of slow. It's a really interesting book, and it has a lot going on. Dean will talk more about maybe the context of this book in a minute. But we wanted to start off just by kind of going through the introduction and getting a better grasp on the paradigm of apocalypticism within Christianity and within sort of the Jewish world as well, and think through what are the hallmarks of that particular genre of literature. So anyways, that's what we're going to do in this episode. We'll be doing chapter 1 this time, and then we'll talk about the rest of the book, maybe a different episode.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. As we settle into our own personal Super Bowl of the book of Revelation, ba-na-na-na-na-na, as they say on TV. The NFL robots are here.
I'm not sure if that's right.
The NFL robots are here. They're having their Bible study, and we're here to accompany them. That's the danger of metaphor, and there are many dangers with metaphor, as we'll discover reading the book of Revelation. This book, it is very interesting because Pablo Ricard, he was a Chilean priest who was pretty involved in Christians for Socialism. He was also trained in economics and was quite a interesting guy. He wrote lots of cool essays and books, but he was exiled, like so many, during the Pinochet coup and spent most of his time in Costa Rica at a place for the acronym is DEI, which I think is very funny, but it was the Department of Ecumenical Investigations is how it translates, basically. And he was there. Franz Hinkle-Lemaire was there. Several others, Young Mo-sung, lots of people invested in kind of thinking through economics and theology. And he's an interesting person because I think that, I don't know, as a priest in particular who has, a good understanding of economics, he is able to come at the Bible in some pretty unique ways. Matt and I quoted him a lot also in our book, Enough is Enough, coming out in May. So just a cool, I think kind of underread liberation theologian. He's not like a Leonardo Boff or Gustavo Gutierrez. I feel like most people have probably not heard of Pablo Ricard. So now you have, and you can You can bother your seminary professor with that information if you want. This book also is cool because it kind of demonstrates how a liberation theologian approaches the Bible in general. So we read some from Elizabeth Schüssler Fiorenza, who's also approaching it in a cool, liberation theology kind of way. But this book is neat because in the introduction, Richard kind of explains like how it came about. And he says, on the one hand, there is that kind of like boring scholarly analysis that he, has apprenticed himself to. He's aware of the conversations in the academy, biblical studies, all that kind of stuff. And that definitely comes out in the book. But he points out also that the real context for it, which he says is more important, comes from a series of biblical workshops that he had done with pastoral agents across Latin America. He names a bunch of countries, Costa Rica, Panama, Nicaragua, El Salvador, several more. And he says the main participants in these workshops, biblical workshops, have been peasants and indigenous people, leaders of Christian-based communities in similar groups. They averaged about 80 people each. And in them, they kind of get together and, work on the Bible, think about the Bible, interpret the Bible together. And what's really neat is he says that this book it comes out of that experience of kind of doing these workshops. But he says it's also his way of giving back to those communities, that they're kind of the interlocutors. And so he's kind of like, this is the summation of the progress that we've made. And I feel like that's something we've seen in other stuff we've read on the show before. Ernesto Cardenal's Gospel in Solentiname, for example, where all these Nicaraguan peasants are rereading the biblical text and coming up with kind of insights from their own social position. And to see somebody do that with the Book of Revelation specifically is so useful. And I feel like this book is a lot more fun to read than some of the other stuff that we've read, because it also bears that kind of like, I don't know, people's movement kind of vibe to it. So it's pretty fun. I don't know, Matt, what's your first impression of all that, of kind of reading a commentary on Revelation that comes out of that particular context?
Yeah, it is very fun. You're right. Something that I would note, though, is that it is not tonally like the Gospel in Solentiname. It is pretty scholarly, pretty rigorous. Not to say that like the Gospel in Solentiname is not rigorous or whatever that might mean in that context, but it's just like a different tone. It is far more a work of theology than it is just like vibing and talking to people about what they think. But
True.
Yeah, I mean, it's cool, though, that it kind of comes out of that context. One really quick note before we jump into talking about the book specifically. Sorry to like suddenly bring this conversation to a stop, but if you want to follow along at home, you can find this book on archive.org, which it's up there, and we'll link to it in the show notes. And you can also, if you wanted to, you can buy a freshly printed copy from Winstanley, which I'll also link in there. It's really worth reading, though, if you're a fan of Revelation. Like we know that you probably are. Okay, but then, I've taken the wind out of the sails, and now I'm going to put the wind back into sails. Let's dive right back into it. So the very first chapter is kind of trying to parse out exactly it's trying to parse out like how to situate Revelation as a genre or as like a sociological existence within sort of early Christianity. To do that, Ricard starts off just by kind of laying out the ways that prophetic literature and apocalyptic literature are connected, but also, importantly, different. So let me read this first bit here, and we can talk about maybe this like big theme, because Revelation is both, I think, prophetic in some ways, but also apocalyptic mainly, and we'll talk about how. So Ricard starts off the very first chapter by saying, as a rule, prophecy takes place in an orderly world, one in which the prophet announces God's word. Apocalyptic, by contrast, arises when this organized world has been destroyed and when the believer is excluded from the world and thrown out into the chaos of marginality. Apocalyptic strives to rebuild consciousness so as to make it possible to rebuild different worlds. So I think what you have from this, first touchstone here in the prophetic and apocalyptic paradigms is something that we saw in the book that we read last week, or maybe a few weeks ago, depending on the chronology you're listening to these in, from Elizabeth Schüssler Fiorenza, basically her take was that Revelation is activating a whole sort of new constellation of metaphor and symbols to create sort of a new world or a new space to inhabit within Christianity. And what we're getting here is something similar, right? Sort of a taxonomic take on what prophecy is and what apocalypticism is. And I actually like this a lot. And I think it is kind of helpful for understanding maybe where you sit within Christianity, or where you at least find the most, I don't know, maybe the most power, the most motion, or the most, whatever it is within Christianity that you like to grab onto. I was thinking about the ways that even different like Christian social movements kind of play into these different categories. Like, for example, like William Barber and the Poor People's Campaign is very much a prophetic movement, right? It's always about looking at the world that we live in that does have a particular order, but it's not a just order, right? And they're using biblical texts to call for justice, to kind of call for a reorientation of society and so on. And that's prophetic, a perfectly good use of biblical texts, and a very faithful way to kind of have a social movement. But then I was thinking about all the other kind of apocalypticism that exists within Christianity that is equally powerful, but also harder to, always make exact sense of. Like, like I don't know. Last week on the podcast, we talked a little bit about Shane Claiborne and the whole idea of new monasticism, and that is a type of apocalypticism as well, right? It's people inhabiting a new world that doesn't quite exist yet, and they're sort of pointing towards it in all kinds of different ways. And there's all kinds of other Christian movements that have done that as well. Like I think also last week we mentioned the Brethren of the Free Spirit, the medieval Christian weirdos who thought that breaking the law was okay and you could steal from people because they were living in sort of a different type of world with different rules that normal people didn't know about. So yeah, I don't know. Apocalypticism and prophetic literature, they both have a really important place within Christianity and politics discussions, but I guess it's pretty clear to see what one Revelation is, right? It's apocalyptic by and large. It's a new world that has all kinds of new symbols that we have to pay attention to. Dean, what did you think about this sort of taxonomic take at the very beginning of the chapter?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because usually we kind of associate the prophetic and the apocalyptic together in Christianity, at least in progressive Christianity, as kind of like two sides of the same coin, or like just two different ways of saying the same thing, which is, I don't know, social justice, or like calling the authorities to account, whatever that might be, a kind of oppositional posture. But it was interesting to see someone like Richard pull that apart and say that, well, they're kind of analytically distinct, even if they have a kinship, or like, I don't know, they have like family resemblance or something. And I had never really thought about that before. And it actually made me think a lot about, like, I guess how you would plot the kind of like the Christian response to a Christian empire in particular. And I think, we'll learn more about that as we read the book. But it's like, if you're in a situation where Donald Trump and his administration is kind of buoyed up by Christianity, it is like a Christian expression of power. It's a Christian world in which violence is deployed and enacted and defended and all that kind of stuff. At that point, do you kind of take the prophetic path where you're calling the nation back to a certain conscience, or calling the nation back to some kind of alternative order, to a godly order, whatever? Or do you kind of recognize that that is the ultimate destruction of the symbolic universe that made sense, and we need like a completely different radical symbolic change? And I feel like, you probably don't really have to make a choice, or like they don't have to be oppositional or pitted against each other or whatever, but it kind of like made me think differently, I guess, about Christian orientations toward Christian empire in a way that I'm still not really settled with, which I think is really valuable and helpful. So that was like a fun bit to kind of keep pulling on over time.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we can come back to this idea whenever we want to. I was also thinking about the ways that that the prophetic tradition within Christianity, it can spin off in so many different ways depending on its particular orientation or what other types of ideological machines you have it hooked up to. But prophecy can be radical or revolutionary or liberatory, but it can also be extremely conservative too, right? The the gesture of calling back to a particular type or earlier form of existence is always fraught with danger when it comes to politics as well. So maybe something to keep a finger on.
Yeah, and obviously same with apocalypticism, given that
well, big time.
Christian Zionism is an apocalypticism that's quite bad, and these are always unstable, hazardous materials to work with. There's something too that's kind of interesting about there's a bunch of places where Richard is sort of figuring out where do these kind of impulses appear in the biblical text, and he also tries to figure out where it appears in our own time, which we can talk about in just a minute. But one thing I thought was interesting too is sometimes historically, he goes through the kind of post-exilic period in the Bible, yesterday's prophetic movement can become tomorrow's apocalyptic movement, or what yesterday sounded very prophetic could be ossified into a bad structure of the ruling class. And then you need kind of this apocalyptic moment to break through that rather than pull you back to somewhere else. But at the same time, if you're trying to build a new society, maybe you need a prophetic kind of movement to do that. So there's sort of a different set of functions, or the prophetic moment is kind of I guess it's internal to the order that exists. It's trying to work within that order for better and for worse. And the apocalyptic is external to it, or trying to become external to it, also for better and for worse. So I thought that was neat too, I guess, as a analytic distinction where, again, they don't necessarily have to be put in total opposition, but they have this weird, almost dialectical relationship for Richard in the biblical story.
Yeah, it is. That's interesting. Well, I mean, speaking of the book of Revelation in particular, I mean, you see both ideas play out in different parts of it, right? In the letters at the beginning of Revelation, you have more of a prophetic tone where John, or the author, whoever they might be, they're giving a sort of prophetic word to the churches of Asia Minor. And then after that, though, you have a radical break, and it's what are we even talking about here? There's Jesus with a sword coming out of his mouth, and a whole sort of new set of things to start dealing with. So anyways, both those things come out in Revelation, but Pablo Ricard has this really interesting way of constantly kind of bringing it back to what is happening in Latin America at any given point, really. Just a bit after this sort of taxonomy of prophetic and apocalyptic literature, Ricard says, we could take an example from our own history, and speaking of apocalypse, that is, we could take an example of our own history in Latin America and the Caribbean in order to better understand these observations. What the year 586 meant in the history of Israel, that's the return of the Israelites from exile. 586 meant in the history of Israel took place in the history of our continent in 1492. That year was also one of complete destruction. In this instance of the indigenous people, a destruction that was economic, political, cultural, and religious. I like this observation because it does kind of make the symbolic world make more sense. The symbolic world of Revelation make more sense, describing the shattering of meaning, describing the overturning of all kinds of structures in the face of destruction. It's hard for us to kind of grasp in terms of what that means in the post-apostolic era of Christianity, but it does make a little bit more sense to me, given what I know of decolonial theory and whatever, of talking about apocalypse in terms of 1492. So anyways, I thought that was quite interesting, a helpful relational observation.
Yeah, and actually he goes on to say, too, alongside this apocalyptic indigenous story, we find the prophetic response of Fray Bartolomé de las Casas. Because he's Spanish and a bishop, this prophet is able to act within the system. We thus observe an apocalyptic response that arises out of the chaos into which the indigenous people have been plunged, and a prophetic response within the system. And I think that's pretty interesting. For people who don't know, I guess, Bartolomé de las Casas, which was a really interesting Dominican priest who came to the Americas during the first wave of colonization and was pretty, I don't know, bummed out about that whole situation and wrote some very famous theological interpretation of the destruction of indigenous peoples and the genocide that was taking place, condemning it, and pleaded with the Spanish royalty to quit supporting it. Also, lots of complicated stuff involved with him, and his relationship to slavery and Africans and indigenous folks, a complicated time. But he is remembered as kind of like trying to figure out, what is the kind of, I guess, like, when people say, like, when you're looking back at historical injustices and you're like, well, it was just the time, like, people just took it for granted that you should, like, genocide a culture or, like, enslave a bunch of people or whatever. It's important to identify these kind of characters like De Las Casas, because he did not think that. He, like, saw people being abused and said, that's not good. We shouldn't do that. So it's interesting to kind of take that as an example where you have a prophetic response that is different, not by virtue of it being like better or worse or more conservative or more revolutionary, but kind of a result of his social position. Like he's still trying to kind of act within a particular system of meaning making, whereas indigenous peoples on the receiving end of colonialism are having their meaning completely eradicated and destroyed. So anyway, all very interesting. And I guess one other piece on that too. Richard is sort of, when he talks about the apocalypticism of colonialism, he sort of, he appeals to like a syncretic indigenous Christian myth making that kind of arises to make sense of all that as well, which he sees as like an apocalyptic spirituality rather than a prophetic one. So anyway, all that to say, just more to like keep complicating the kind of differentiation of roles and responsibilities there, maybe.
Cool. Well, we'll probably come back to that at some point. more on the genocide of indigenous people, I'm sure, is to follow. But let's pivot away from that for a moment to talk more about Ricard's historical framing of the Book of Revelation and how that kind of plays into this whole conversation. So, he kind of sets up this whole thing about prophecy and apocalypticism. And then he says, if we want to really understand the Book of Revelation, the Revelation of John, we can't just look at it individually. We have to think about the whole history of apocalyptic literature between the Book of Daniel and the Book of Revelation. Specifically those two books, because Daniel is the only other sort of apocalyptic text that makes it into the Bible itself, which is interesting. So he has this nice chart in the book where he's kind of trying to show you the ways that these historical apocalyptic literatures play into the Jesus movement, and which also play into the writing of Revelation itself. So, he with this chart, he's trying to demonstrate that. So Daniel is written in 167 BCE, which is fine. So you have Daniel as sort of apocalyptic literature, and that spins off into all kinds of other types of apocalyptic literature, like books that you've never read that aren't in the standard Bible, like First Enoch and
the Bones
book, First Enoch, Second Baruch, Fourth Ezra. You get all kinds of stuff about the Maccabees, and all that stuff is great. But all of that apocalyptic literature, in addition to the Book of Daniel, it might not make it into the Bible proper, but it is kind of hanging out in the background. And that is the thing that we need to be aware of, is that just because it's not in the Bible, because, whatever, Oldie McOldface, Bishop of Rome, didn't put it in there, it doesn't mean that doesn't exist. It does exist, and in fact, it's like sort of the background of the Jesus movement, and it's the background of it's the background and oftentimes the antagonist to the emerging apostolic church as it exists kind of in the early days of Christianity. All of those things kind of competing against one another in sort of a big cacophony of, I don't know, different movements and different people and different heresies and ideas. They're all rubbing up against each other, and out of that is where we get Revelation. So there's this kind of big inheritance of things going on in the background where we finally get, the Book of Revelation, which, reads quite odd to us, but it has all these other things going on back there. Here, for example, Ricard says one key to interpreting Revelation is its relationship to early Christian prophecy and to the apostolic and especially the Pauline movements. Another key is the rootedness of this prophecy and theology in Jewish and Judeo-Christian apocalyptic. It has been a mistake to contrast prophecy and apocalyptic in the New Testament too radically. So there's all this other stuff hanging out in the background is kind of the point here. And the story that Ricard tells about these things is quite interesting. So he's primarily interested in the kind of period that Revelation is being written in. So this is I guess what's called the post-apostolic moment, where everyone who knew Jesus personally is dead and gone. So he says the dating of Revelation is always kind of up for debate, but he says from 90 to 96 CE. So after quite a bit of tumult within Christianity, but before Christianity becomes Christendom proper. And within those movements, he says that Christianity is actually extremely pluralistic. There's all kinds of Christianities floating around, which is not usually the story that we think about when we think about early Christendom. We usually think about a type of apostolic Christianity emerging out of the Jesus movement. And it's whole and then it splits off. But the story that you get from Ricard is actually quite different. It's like never whole. It's always just kind of a variation of splits. So the four kind of splits that Ricard is interested in talking out and kind of figuring out apocalypticism, between are the sort of first century Jewish Christianity, Hellenistic Christianity, and then also like apocalyptic Christianity. With some other sort of variations in there in between, Montanism and other types of like heretical movements that don't sort of pass the test for Christendom, but do kind of persist throughout Christian history in one way or another. But anyways, these are the sort of early tensions that are in the background of Revelation, but all are kind of important as they sort of vie for a type of dominance within the story.
Yeah, it's actually interesting to read all that because, I mean, even now there's like a long debate about early Christianity and Judaism and like when does Christianity start to be Christianity and when is it separate from Judaism? At what point is it kind of like understood as like a minoritarian strand within Judaism, and how does it construct itself against Judaism to understand itself? All kinds of complicated conversations going on. Man, you can read so much stuff about it. There's a ton of interesting stuff, and actually probably throughout the year we'll maybe have to get into more of it because there's like a really neat current of thinking in people like Jacob Tabbas and this kind of like messianic reading of St. Paul as an apocalyptic figure. But anyway, neither here nor there. Not something we can deal with right now. But there's, I think, something interesting at seeing Richard at least like try to sort of like affirm that there is a variety of different ways of people trying to make sense of like what it means to be some kind of community inspired by Jesus Christ. And we talked about this a few weeks ago when we were saying the interesting thing about Revelation is that it's like a position of opposition to the Roman Empire, which is different from some of the other voices in the New Testament even, which are more positions of kind of accommodation or not identification with the empire, but you kind of like just keep your head down and, do your best and wait for Jesus to come back. Whereas Revelation is no lukewarm people in here. Like God will spit you out. You've got to maintain yourself against the kind of pollution of the empire. And I think it's cool to see Richard trying to identify just like a variety of different communities that had grown up to, I guess, figure out what to do in light of both Jesus and the kind of ongoing complex, violent reality of the Roman Empire. So that I think is really valuable, whatever else we make of like the, I don't know, historicization that has happened in the last like 30 years of research since this book was written. And what's especially interesting is how Richard at least seizes on a certain apocalyptic moment that he wants to also root in a Jewish apocalyptic sensibility. That too, I think, is very complicated to talk about, but worth getting into. So, for example, he says, Christian apocalyptic served as a bridge between the Jewish apocalyptic tradition and Christianity. That such was the case is indicated by by the impact of the book of Daniel on the Jesus movement in early Christian tradition and throughout the subsequent history of Christianity, especially in popular Christian circles. Christian apocalyptic served as a bridge between the popular Jewish apocalyptic movements, with all their symbolic and theological riches, and Christian liberating movements throughout the history of Christianity. And I think that's something that's really neat, is that like he's trying to sort of express that Revelation feels weird, like you said, Matt, because it's like out of step with the rest of the canonized New Testament. But it doesn't feel weird if you know a lot about kind of Jewish apocalyptic sensibilities in literature. Like, it's not just dropped out of the sky. It's coming out of its own kind of tradition of literature and kind of, a disposition toward the world, that sort of thing. And I think that's also quite interesting that, like, Revelation in a weird way kind of provides like a way for Christians to like continually be in touch with the radical Jewish part of Christianity. And Jesus, he thinks, is also like a product of that kind of apocalyptic thinking. So that, I think, is really fascinating. Something you don't really hear, something you don't get in the Left Behind movies, for example.
Speaking of Left Behind movies, no, just kidding. Not speaking of them. Something that I was thinking about as I was reading this book was that, it's the assertion over and over again that there's something apocalyptic within Christianity and something apocalyptic within Revelation. And like, that seems true, right? There's this sort of new symbolic universe. But it's like, I guess the question I kept asking myself is like, what is it that is the apocalypse here? Is it the end? Is it the end of all things, right? It's the eschaton. It's the curtain call of God or whatever. But Ricard actually has a different take that is, kind of helpful. So speaking of apocalypticism, he says that resurrection is common in apocalyptic thought in general. What is new in the Christian apocalyptic is that resurrection has already taken place in Jesus. If Jesus rose from the dead, then resurrection of the dead is possible, and the time of resurrection has already begun. Kind of an interesting observation, though, that like what is apocalyptic in Revelation isn't necessarily the end of all things. Like the eschatology bit is there for sure. Like, you can't deny that whatsoever. But the apocalyptic theme is not necessarily that the world is going to be eaten up by the beast or whatever. The apocalyptic thing is that Jesus rose from the dead, and that is the inauguration of the new world that we're living in here. And that is, I think, a radically different take than the ways that evangelicals read this book. It's for them, it's all about the sort of end of the world stuff and when you're going to get raptured and where your clothes are going to be when you're naked in heaven. But this is a bit different. To think about the apocalyptic event isn't what is to come, but it's what's already happened, I guess, is the interesting observation.
Yeah, as Semisonic put it in their great apocalyptic song, every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end. And that is exactly what's happening at closing time in history in the Bible. I agree.
Wow, great. Closing time in history is my favorite Francis Fukuyama book.
So kind of continuing on that theme, though, the question is kind of like, what do you do if you think that there's been like a cosmos shift? And Richard says too that Christians have always struggled with that impulse. There's a kind of temptation to then retreat into some individual interpretation of spirituality where Jesus has affected the cosmos, but really that only affects your personal relationship with God. And you, again, kind of like keep your head down until all the cosmos is sorted out by God at the end. And you just try to, listen to what Bob and Larry have to tell you at VeggieTales. And as long as you do that, you'll be okay. Whereas on the contrary, he thinks Revelation is doing something totally different, which speaks to the stuff we read in Fiorenza, where it's not just spiritualization of reality, but on the contrary, it's like because there's this kind of cosmic change that Jesus defeats death or the principalities of the world, that commits us also to a material interpretation of that change, which for John is, again, a kind of like position of opposition. And that also is a contrast with other Christian impulses floating around at the time. In particular, Richard talks about what he calls a Hellenistic Christianity. He says, a Hellenistic theology comes into being, one that is intellectualist, individualist, elitist in nature, and foreign to the Christian life of the people. Such Christian elites never undertook a discernment of Hellenism or evangelized it, but took it on as it was. Hellenism being a kind of like, I guess like accommodationist approach to Roman culture. Plato and Aristotle replaced the historical memory of Jesus and the apostolic tradition. It was Hellenism that changed Christianity. Christianity did not evangelize Hellenism, the church was unable to evangelize the dominant culture because that culture had already changed the ruling group in the church. This is a pretty radical thing for a Roman Catholic priest to say. I feel like that's important to mention. I mean, when you go to the city of Rome, the thesis that Richard is telling you here could not be more obvious, right? You go to like the Temple of Minerva, and now it's the Temple of, I don't know, the Virgin Mary or whatever it might be. And the ultimate story of Christendom is that that's the strand that kind of ends up getting the right to sort of like put the stamp on what Christianity is or will be, at least in an official sense. And what Richard is saying is that Revelation is actually coming at the question of Christianity and what should it be and what, how should it be kind of understood to be authentically Christian. That is a perspective coming from the position of oppression. So not trying to accommodate itself to the situation around it, but on the contrary, trying to stake out a whole new symbolic universe. And I think that is also a really interesting bit of like, I guess kind of the limitations of the prophetic approach at that particular historical moment for Richard. Like the prophetic kind of vocation is a bit harder because, it's occupied Judaism and or occupied kind of land. And you're trying to like figure out exactly how to kind of call like a pretty corrupt situation back to its own origins. King Herod is doing a bad job and all this kind of complicated stuff. And the idea that Revelation is just trying to like blow everything apart rather than keep that symbolic universe together, I think is a pretty cool like look at what the book is trying to effect as like a device in the world.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I always appreciate when somebody is going to tell me that Plato and Aristotle, I mean, they're fine. These guys are fine. I like them, but maybe they don't belong in Christianity as much as we think they do. Always good stuff. Cool. We don't have much time left, so I want to skip ahead just a little bit here. There's some more historical stuff in here that Ricard has about the church in Asia Minor and sort of distinguishing leaders of the church as prophets against bishops, which is kind of an interesting observation that he draws out. But I think the most exciting part of this book, or this first chapter to me, was the next bit, which sort of shifts gears a bit. So the heading here is Sociology and Apocalypse. And Ricard says that apocalyptic literature is a literature of oppressed people. He says that apocalyptic literature expresses the worldview of the poorest and most oppressed, humiliated, outcast sectors of society, those who do not feel their own authorities, understand them, or speak for them, those who have an alternative view of history or theological vision, one that is different from the ruling group. Obviously, like we've been kind of touching on that idea in a few different episodes, but that makes Revelation, I think, a lot more exciting to us. It's a new symbolic universe. We say that over and over again, but it's not just a new symbolic universe written from the perspective of like, I don't know, anybody. It's written from the perspective of oppressed people. And kind of getting into the situation a little bit deeper, Ricard continues on saying that the main problem underlying the revelation of John is not so much persecution. So the persecution of Christians, which is another thing we've talked about quite a bit, depending on who exactly is in charge of Rome at any given moment. So it's not necessarily about persecution, but instead it's about oppression and exclusion, two characteristics that he parses out at some length to kind of describe them a bit more explicitly. He says, because of their consciousness and their faith, Christian communities can neither buy nor sell, which is the mark of the beast bit from Revelation, you might recall. And they can't participate in society culturally, and they are outcasts. So this overall vibe of Revelation, where Christians are, not lukewarm. They're not making any concessions to empire. They're sort of living in these alternative types of communities against empire, against the world. Which leads to persecution for sure. That's fine. Yeah. But also exclusion, something that Pablo Ricard says is even worse than exploitation or oppression. He says that the excluded are completely outside, do not count, and their death has no effect on the system. This is the basic social context out of which revelation arises, which is not to deny situations of ongoing oppression and particular moments of persecution, which are also a fact. And then he says this: in the third world today, exclusion is becoming more universal and more defining of a situation than the reality of poverty, oppression, and persecution. Bringing this all back to sort of like the contemporary reading of the third world today, and what Revelation has to say to the oppressed people that exist right now. So, anyways, exclusion is the underlying condition of Revelation, something that still has a lot to say to us. Very interesting.
Yeah, super interesting. And I guess also in the interest of time, it's good to get a couple more like thematic bits on the table before we start to go through the book, which is kind of organized more as a commentary. So we'll be able to return to a lot of these points as we go. But something I think is interesting too on that exclusion part is Richard is really trying to take seriously the fact that Revelation is like doing something from that position. And I feel like there's always two things that come up even in my own like head-scratching moments around Revelation, which are, what do you do with all these wild symbols and images that are going on in the text? You know, like this is not Marx's capital for the first century, right? Like the author of Revelation did not take the time, even though it's called an unveiling, right? An apocalyptic piece of literature. He didn't take the time to like lay out in extremely clear terms, an economic analysis of why Christians are being excluded or how. But he tries to kind of create a mythological universe that actually does clarify that situation from the position of the oppressed. And something I think is really interesting about that challenged me is like, you actually don't want to put all the myths of Revelation under the microscope and then try to like, I don't know, like dissect them and figure out exactly like what their true historical core might be such that they become legible. On the contrary, the point of myth making is doing something else. And Richard puts it this way. He says, studies of apocalyptic have been flawed by a lack of interest in the social and historical context and by a literalist and doctrinal approach. Liberalism and modernity, moreover, have rendered us incapable of understanding symbols and myths in historical terms. Popular cultures in Latin America and the Caribbean, particularly indigenous cultures, have re-educated us to understand myths and symbols, not literally, but in a historical and liberating key. He says myth usually employs elements of the cosmos, the sun, moon, stars, sky, earth, chaos, etc. It also constructs symbols out of human realities, and he goes through like a whole bunch of wild symbols that you see in the Bible. He says, if cosmic reality is invoked, the aim is to provide drama and urgency to processes within history. And just a couple of conclusions he makes. He says, it's important to analyze the use or function of myth and symbols. Myth and symbol are polysemic. They have multiple meanings, and thus are able to communicate different messages at the same time. When Rome is symbolized as Babylon, the intention is to assert that it's both oppressive and idolatrous. The woman clothed with the sun is a myth used to signify simultaneously humankind, a new Eve opting for life, the people of God that begets the Messiah, the Christian community, and Mary, the mother of the Messiah. Myth always remains open and ready for new meanings, provided that its internal consistency and the historical context in which it arose and made history are respected. He goes on also to say that myth is really a kind of matter of like providing an identity. He says it's supposed to mobilize a community or a specific group, especially in a situation in which the community's previous identifying structures have been completely destroyed, or in circumstances of extreme oppression or persecution in which the community is on the brink of disappearing. So all that to say, like, you know, the point is not to figure out what is the one secret thing that John is trying to get you to think about when he's telling you about, I don't know, a big animal with a ton of eyes that's like circling around the throne of God or something crazy. On the contrary, it's actually to provide like the foundation for a proliferation of meaning, a ton of meaning, a bunch more meaning. It's like a surplus of thinking. And there's this kind of internal consistency that maybe allows you to kind of find your way in that meaning making, specifically a kind of internal consistency of opposition to oppression and that kind of hope for liberation. So I thought that was really neat. I feel like with Revelation, I'm always trying to figure out like what's the secret meaning underneath. And what I like about Pablo Richard is he's being like, well, don't do that. Just try to find like what's the drama that's trying? How is he trying to ratchet up your relation to history by making things weird on purpose?
Yeah. I mean, this explanation I think makes it make a bit more sense, right? Because you're getting all of this old, like, for somebody writing in 90 CE, right? Why are they writing about Babylon? Well, they're writing about Babylon because like that's the background of apocalyptic literature that people will have read, that they were familiar with already, right? So Babylon's in the mix as, as like you're saying, as part of the drama, and it's like identifiable. And then there's some mythological slippage between Babylon and Rome, right? And it's like, oh, okay, you can see the connection that's being made between these two things. And then even more so, then you have this whole theme of exclusion as well, about that you can't just kind of protest against the system from within because you're completely excluded from without. So you need this whole constellation of other explanatory models and myths to actually get you somewhere. But yeah, I mean, it makes more sense when you look at it kind of from that big picture perspective. So anyways, this book is really helpful for that understanding, I think.
Yeah. One other last theme I thought would be helpful, the other thing that kind of nags at me, is the language around violence in Revelation. I mean, Fiorenza, she talks about how that is a liability in the book of Revelation, that, at a certain point, it kind of feels like the author of Revelation didn't kind of take their own critique far enough. Like they couldn't kind of turn the anti-imperial mindset back onto their own kind of work. And so the risk is that you actually like reinscribe the kind of tropes that you don't like. So, Caesar might be bad, but instead you just want like the Jesus Caesar instead. There's kind of a risk there going on. Richard has sort of a different tack. He says that an ethical issue that gives rise to a great deal of discussion about apocalyptic is that of the violence and hatred that many texts would seem to transmit. The function of these texts is not to generate violence or hatred, but rather to express the situation of extreme oppression and suffering that the people of God are experiencing. The language of people living in dire want or under cruel persecution today is not very different. We cannot expect the poor to speak the refined diplomatic language of the powerful. The language of Revelation is a language of people in situations of extreme oppression and suffering. If Revelation uses such language, it's partly in order to bring about a catharsis in its hearers, but it's also so that they may feel that they have attained their identity, and through the message of Revelation may transform their hatred into awareness. And then he goes on to talk a little bit about how the text is like a series of opportunities for discernment, trying to like figure out, what's a legitimate power and what's an illegitimate power. I think one thing that's interesting to me is like, I think on the one hand that is true. Like, if you start reading literature from historically oppressed peoples, there's often a lot of, parts of it that will make you uncomfortable. And that makes sense. I mean, if you're in a situation of total violence all the time, it is like not even unreasonable, I don't think, to wish for a kind of violent solution to that situation. Lots of complicated feelings and thoughts to have about that. I think that's true. When you read the book of Revelation, you can kind of like contextualize or make legible the violence that's in the book if you kind of put it in that framing. However, I do think that he kind of like maybe lets us off the hook too early. Like, I feel like there's a lot of I guess I prefer the kind of Fiorenza approach of just being like, I don't know, it's maybe legible within that, but not excusable within that. And like, you probably don't want to, absorb that kind of violence in particular. So anyway, something that I'm sure will also come up again in the book when he gets to like specific examples of that happening in the text, and I guess we'll see how he navigates it there. But I thought that was interesting as like a good point, but one that maybe was not sufficiently developed or didn't satisfy me in the end.
No, that's fair. That makes sense. Cool. Well, there's even more things we didn't talk about in this first chapter, and I guess that's okay. Maybe we'll come back to them, maybe we won't, but you can go read them yourselves if you want to on archive.org, and I have the link in the show notes, so go check it out if you want to know more about Pablo Richard's takes on Revelation. Anyways, Dean, what are your big takeaways from reading this first chapter that we can wrap up the episode with?
Yeah, I think my big takeaway is I feel like it's really interesting to kind of read a liberation theologian coming at the Bible with the like the experimentation of reading these kinds of texts with people who are themselves oppressed. And I feel like that does give you a qualitatively different take on what the text could be. The comparison with the Gospel in Solentiname, I think, is a good one, where like oftentimes they'll read a parable that in the first world I've heard in a church preached in such a way that like the rich guy in the parable is obviously God, and the, you know, whatever he says must be true. Whereas someone in Nicaragua will read it and be like, well, obviously this rich guy cannot be God because rich people are not good. And if you think that, then, you know, what does that unlock in the parable? What's the kind of different message there? So I feel like that's what Richard is already doing with respect to Revelation here. And looking forward to kind of seeing how that opens up some of the actual text. And it'll be good to go through a commentary after all the like place setting stuff that we've read so far. What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I feel similarly. That stuff is very interesting. I guess when I read liberation theology like this, or, you know, or like the Gospel in Solentiname, I'm always reminded how ill-equipped I am to read the Bible. And not just like intellectually. I mean, of course, intellectually, I'm ill-equipped to read the Bible. But like culturally, sociologically, this is a book that is like for me for sure, but not for me. Like, you know, it's a book that I have to do some like real adjustments in my brain to kind of understand in a real way. You know, just like talking about like social positioning or economic class and like reading the Bible, like I kind of have to always keep that in mind and try to think about how can I transcend my circumstances? How can I understand this from an alternative perspective? And it is only by reading liberation theology that I think I can do that. So I don't know, just feeling inadequate coming to the text as like as a sort of like middle class white guy, which is fine, I guess, but just very complicated.
Very complicated. Well, you can get the book and you can read it along with us if you want. It's pretty good. It's not too long. I feel like once we get through this, we'll have all the data we need to really start thinking about our own apocalyptic times.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you support us at $1 a month, just a little bit, you can get an invite to our cool Patreon-only Discord channel where you can meet all kinds of people and talk to them about squirrels, burrito recipes, whether or not we should continue to use Discord based on ongoing security drama. I don't know, so annoying. Anyways, maybe not a good sell. You can also get access to early episodes whenever we are able to produce them, which is, I don't know, kind of rare, but not that rare. And you should do that, because I don't know, we despite the way this podcast ends, we do put a little bit of time and effort into it, and it would be nice. It's nice to be supported by people who listen to it. Okay, our intro music is by Mario Armstrong. Our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. Beside what else are you gonna do? As we kissed in the alley by the Michigan Theater,